Welcome back to 132 Problems Revisiting Mormon Polygamy for the second half of my conversation with Benjamin Shaffer. I know we left you on a bit of a cliffhanger last week, so I'm excited to jump right back in there. I want to again give a huge shout out to Benjamin Shaffer. And thanks, Benjamin, for coming and showing up the way you did. I really appreciate it. I hope that it will be the first of many conversations with, if there are any other people that I've invited many people on who really oppose what I'm doing, who are either members of the church who are very in favor of polygamy, or very bullish on polygamy, or fundamentalists. And I want to continue to extend that invitation. I really do appreciate engagement. And again, I hope that the convivial tone of the conversation that Benjamin and I had can be followed in the comments back and forth. I really like it when we can talk about ideas and engage while we are seeing one another as fellow children of God who are all just trying to do our best as we walk this path. I want to again remind anybody, if you feel like you could donate to help this podcast, it is deeply, deeply appreciated. Thank you so much to all of those who have. And with no more being said, here's the second half of my conversation with Benjamin Shaffer.
My other really big question was, did Denver Snuffer or Phil Davis or someone else or both put you up to this? Because I was concerned that the whole polygamy denial was specifically to give Phil Davis or Denver Snuffer or one of these other cultists power in a movement that I believe is strongly supported. And my concern is that I see the Joseph Smith Never Lived Polygamy whole movement as essentially being propped up by these cultists. And I thought, okay, so what's your connection to all of this? Because that was my accusation and my real concern.
Okay, I will give you my answer. The challenge is, other than telling people, come talk to anyone in my family, come talk to my church leaders, go ask anyone who knows Denver Snuffer or Phil Davis, go ask them so I can tell you exactly. So throughout 2020 and 2021, I was going to leave the church. I was going through extremely difficult times, and I was appalled by the church's reaction after already seeing a lot of problems, right? So a member of, I didn't even know what the doctrine of Christ was, but a guy named Dustin Smith, who since has passed on, who I met a few times, he befriended me online and kept inviting me to things and was actually really supportive when I was going through hard times.
Full disclosure, friend of mine, he's the one who invited me to go meet Phil Davis.
Okay, so he just kept inviting me to gatherings. And at one point when I finally was recovered enough that I was like, okay, it would be nice to be around people, we went to one of these gatherings and I had no idea who the guy was. And so I heard Phil Davis teach. I didn't know that was his name. And personally, I was massively unimpressed. And I just was like, I don't like this. And then when I was talking to people afterward, it felt to me, and I'm hesitant to say this because there are a lot of people that are probably maybe in those meetings that I don't, but just my experience was when I was talking to people afterward, it felt to me like the scriptures I would want to discuss, they weren't very familiar with, but they kind of had their hobby horse scriptures that they knew really well that seemed to be. So that was the one and only meeting I ever went to with anything like that, and was like, okay, this isn't for me. So that was my experience. That's the extent of my experience with Doctrine of Christ. Other than I've come to know more people since then who I have, I just have always been a member of the church. I was, even after 2020 and the time I felt by the Lord told to stay in the church, because I was just saying, tell me where to go. What's better? Where can I go? And I was very strongly told to stay in the church. So that's my experience with the Doctrine of Christ, the full extent of it. And then, people did add me to Facebook groups where conversations were being had, where I would engage sometimes. And so when people say I'm a member of the Doctrine of Christ, I always am like, do they mean the Facebook group that someone added me to? So that's my full extent with the Doctrine of Christ. It sounds like you have a movement.
There is a larger movement, though, right?
Yeah, but
Denver Snuffer,
I wouldn't even know how to tell you who's in it.
He was trying to stay. Denver Snuffer for a long time was trying to stay. I'm a faithful member of the church. I'm not going anywhere. Until he got excommunicated, he was absolutely in the church.
Yeah, so
right? I was a very big fan of his for a long time, ever since he came out with the first book, The Second Comforter, right? Pretty big fan of his. He teaches a lot of good stuff, but that doesn't mean the things haven't gotten weird.
I was finishing up Doctrine of Christ. I was going to say, it sounds to me like you have as much or more association with Doctrine of Christ than I have. I went to a total of one meeting, and then, whatever has happened since that, I have no idea. Then on the other hand, with Denver Snuffer, I did feel very led by the Lord to his first book, which really I was reading in the Book of Mormon, learning things through the scriptures that were hard for me to think, how can I think I know this when, so his book served as a second witness to me and really blessed me right when it came out. And then when I was sad that he was excommunicated, just because I don't like excommunication, but, and there were people who we would meet occasionally who would invite us to something. I just never felt any, I've studied enough with Avraham Gileadi, who also was excommunicated, to know that those movements, and again, I don't want to offend anyone, because I think there are marvelous people everywhere, but also there can be kind of a energy in all of these movements that's like almost a spiritual competition in a way, or I want to be on a platform, or I want to put people on a platform. Where are you in your, like, I just never felt drawn to any of this. So I didn't meet Denver Snuffer for the first time until I was over a year into my podcast. I met him one time, and then I've met him one more time since then. And that's my association with Denver Snuffer. So I am completely only ever a member of the church, and any interaction with these others have been very minuscule and incidental, and only because there was some overlap. And like part of the reason I stopped, I was really disappointed when Denver Snuffer was talking about Section 132 and saying how it came from these different, like someone sent me one of his podcasts or blogs. I never read. All I did was read his first book, and then I read his last book. That's all I've ever read of Denver Snuffer. When I read his blog about that, I was like, you think that 132 was of God? Okay. I'm not very.
Well, he's got a really weird take on it, and by revelation,
he's changed now
in a totally different way. You know?
So I have had him on the podcast, which was, I guess, maybe the second or time I had interacted with him at all. So that's my association. So no, I'm totally doing this. Like, I really did feel like my experience is just genuine. I lost my 2 little girls, felt like called to do this, felt like that was told that was part of the reason that I was always meant to have them, but I was meant to do this, so they couldn't be here. And I was called to do this, and then started out with polygamy is not of God, even though Joseph Smith did it. Joseph made a mistake, then progressed to where I am now through the evidence. So I'm completely sincere, if that answers the question.
Right.
I hope people will believe that, because there's nothing I can do to.
Right. And the other thing, though, that is a tricky thing is that the lens we bring really does make a huge difference on the outcome. This is something George Bernard Shaw said. He said, no one believes the Bible means what it says. Every man believes the Bible says what he means.
Sure. We all have context. We all have to have
and I know I have it too. It's all about context. I actually wrote a whole article on Jacob 2 and 3 called Context is Everything, where I tried to explain that I think the context does not point to monogamy in Jacob 2 and 3.
So what is your context for Jacob 2:31?
Well, I've got my scriptures here. Let's see which one's 31. I mean, I know the whole chapter pretty well, but I don't remember exactly.
I just feel like 30 gets all of the attention, and we kind of leave 31, 32, 33, and 34 alone.
First, I'd like to say, before I even get there, that I think it's in context. And what is that context? I think is broader than just is broader even than the whole chapter. The context is that this is an Old Testament polygamous Torah observant people that had things like levirate marriage in the law, which commanded polygamy in many instances.
That's so funny when people say that. Okay.
I recognize that some people are like, oh, no, they don't have to do that. I remember thinking this rather funny. There's this ceremony called chalitza that Orthodox Jews still do, because most Jews, not all, but most Jews are monogamous. There are some polygamous Jews, but by and large, most of them are monogamous. And there's this ceremony called chalitza, where when a man dies, his widow is supposed to go to his nearest relation, or at least a brother.
His brother.
Or if he doesn't have one, an uncle or something.
And generally, it's always the younger brother, not the married brother. It's very rarely a married brother.
But what she does is she takes off his shoes and spits in his face.
Nope, spits on the ground. Spits on the ground. They say spits in the face is a mistranslation. But she spits on the ground.
Some people spit in the face.
I studied it quite extensively, and I only ever heard.
And my point is, I think it's hilarious that they've turned a punishment into a ritual. Literally, the entire point is, if this guy is not man enough to be a polygamist and take care of this family, then you should punish him. You should take off his shoes. You should throw him at his. You spit on him. You should run him out the gates of your city, and you should call him he who hath had his shoe loosed, because you know this is not an honorable man in Israel. You should, this is like banishment, basically. And now they've turned it into like a ceremony. You just do it because why? I don't know. Like, because we love monogamy more than we love the commandments.
It's usually a younger brother. It has nothing to do with polygamy. Where it comes from is the story of Judah and Tamar, which the story took place before the law was was written. And Judah and Tamar, that story because
that's pretty bad story.
Well,
so you're equating this with them.
Judah was supposed to give and it's supposed to be the younger brother. So the fact that that's the best example,
because someone's younger doesn't mean they're not married. My younger brothers are married. I mean, one of them's divorced twice.
The woman has to be childless. If she's not childless, then it's disallowed by the law explicitly. You can't marry your brother's wife. So she has to be childless. And then it's only to have a child. And it's almost like if you look up a chalitza, it is the younger brother. And that's how it was interpreted in that law too. And that's the story of Judah. He was supposed to give the younger brothers like Onan and then a younger brother again, right? That they didn't carry out. And it came from a context where women were considered property. So the family would pay the bride price.
Society that was highly patriarchal.
Purchased the woman, and her role, the reason the family purchased her was to provide the descendants, right? So if she hadn't fulfilled her role for which she was purchased, the family got to keep trying to use her for her purpose for which she was purchased. So it's not a society, it's not a godly law, it's a societal law, right? The law right before it has something to do with if your slave wants to stay with you after his 7 years are up, you hammer his ear to the awl with a post, right? And he's your ear. And maybe it says you hammer him to the awl of the door, right? That's how you pierce his ear as a symbol. And then there's one after it is something to do with an ox, I believe. I can't remember. I've looked into all of this. It's just not fresh in my mind. We also have the law that if two men are fighting and the wife of one grabs the testicles of the enemy, her hand needs to be cut off. So it's funny to me that we look to these random Old Testament laws.
I love the Torah. I love the Talmud. We
cannot claim that the Bible commands polygamy, and using levirate marriage to try to claim, like the fact that that's the best. 132 clearly says that God commanded Abraham to become polygamous. That's biblically completely inaccurate. And so when we say God never commanded polygamy, and the best example is levirate marriage, that just shows how bottom of the it could be that levirate marriage might in some instances perhaps result in polygamy, maybe. So therefore God commands polygamy. So anyway,
there's also the passages in Kings and Samuel that the church likes to quote, which says that I, the Lord, gave unto your wives, and I would have given you more. The Lord did it.
That's from Nathan, right? And I've done a whole episode on that as well, so we don't have to go into all of it.
Look, there's a whole bunch of things. To me, it's not about one obscure thing. It's all over the place. So yes, I see. What I see is what I see you trying to do when we talk about the context of Jacob 2, is that I'm like, okay, so the entire scriptures are constantly full of polygamy all over the place. And analogies about polygamy, like, for example, Christ and his church that we talked about earlier, as literally almost all of these righteous analogies, or the analogy about the covenant of Israel is always this marriage covenant. All of marriage, all over the place. I don't see lots of divorce all over the place being the primary thing. I see marriage as being.
No, but I do see Adam and Eve, and then I see Lamech.
We've got a big difference there.
I see Adam and Eve, and then I see Lamech, who was the first one who took multiple wives. And then I see
But read the Bible in English and you think Adam and Eve are names. Adam and Eve are titles. And in Hebrew, Hava, HVH, Hava, which is we translate as Eve, is a plural word. I don't think Adam and Eve were monogamists.
Brigham Young even taught that Adam just brought one one woman.
Well, right now, the lecture at the Veil, right? He says, and Adam brought one of his wives with him, who such and such, right? But everything from Jewish midrashes to plenty of other statements by Brigham Young seem to indicate to me that there were definitely multiple wives here involved. There's Lilith, who gets named, and Eve is the generic term, and there's also a Sarah, which is why Sarah was renamed Sarah instead of Sarai. That gets talked about in some of these other documents. Now, again, not just Genesis in the King James Version, but I see this context throughout history. And so
okay, I do want to know what context. Okay, I do want to know the context you read. We can just focus specifically on 31, but we can also go through 35. Like 31 through second Nephi, Jacob 2, 31 through 35, I think don't get enough focus. And so I just want to, and then we can talk, and then I have other questions. I do want to have another discussion, because I think it'd be fascinating. So you can just.
So 31 through 35? Okay, so I've got it right here. Jacob 2, 31 through 35. For behold, I, the Lord, have seen the sorrow and heard the mourning of the daughters of my people in the land of Jerusalem. Yea, and in all the lands of my people, because of the wickedness and abominations of their husbands. And I will not suffer, saith the Lord of hosts, that the cries of the fair daughters of this people, which I have led out of the land of Jerusalem, should come up unto me against the men of my people, saith the Lord of hosts. For they shall not lead away captive the daughters of my people because of their tenderness. Save I shall visit them with a sore curse, even unto destruction. For they shall not commit whoredoms like unto them of old, saith the Lord of hosts. And now behold, my brethren, ye know that these commandments were given to our father Lehi. Wherefore ye have known them before, and ye have come unto great condemnation, for ye have done these things which ye ought not to have done. Behold, ye have done greater iniquities than the Lamanites, our brethren. Ye have broken the hearts of your tender wives, and lost the confidence of your children, because of your bad examples before them, and the sobbings of their hearts ascend unto God against you. Because of the strictness of the word of God, which cometh down against you, many hearts died, pierced with deep wounds.
So what is your context when you read verse 30, which says, so the entire preface before that is saying, having many wives and concubines is an abomination. Having more than one wife is an abomination. I reject it.
I don't think it says that anywhere in Jacob 2. Not the. Okay, you're paraphrasing it in your point of view, and I don't see that.
Okay, we'll just go to 24. Behold, David and Solomon.
That's the term he used. Whoredoms are being committed.
So violence. It says, behold, David.
Captivity.
Verse 24. Behold. Behold, David and Solomon truly had many wives and concubines, which thing was abominable before me, saith the Lord. That's pretty clear. We go down to verse 34, if I will, saith the Lord of hosts, raise up seed unto me. And we could definitely talk about this. I will command my people, otherwise they shall hearken unto these things. For behold, I, the Lord, have seen the sorrow and heard the mourning of the daughters of my people in the land of Jerusalem and in all the lands of my people. And it goes on the entire rest of the chapter talking about God giving the reason for the command. God giving the reason why having many wives and concubines is an abomination that is forbidden. So that seems to always be ignored. So anyway, you go ahead and respond, then I'll tell you my thoughts.
I would respond to that by saying, I think you see the context very differently than I do here. Were there horrible things that happened among these people? Absolutely. There was clearly violence. He talks about being led away captive. I assume that means literally kidnapping and rape. To be led away captive because of their weakness, because of their tenderness. I'm like, okay, so these people are literally abducting people.
Or we could even turn it into in early Utah when the leaders or the missionaries would go abroad and say, no, we're not polygamists. Look, here's section 101 in our Doctrine and Covenants. Then the people are led away to Utah where there's not really an escape. And all of a sudden, surprise, you have to be married to this man to pay back the perpetual emigration fund, or you have to be married to this man or you won't eat. That happened all the time in early Utah. That sounds like being led away captive to me.
Interesting. Again, history that I would disagree with on several points. I mean, like Wilford Woodruff baptized more people in England than anybody, basically. And the publications that you can read in the Millennial Star published in England that talk about plural marriage are many.
What year should they start?
Defenses.
Yeah,
you know what I mean? And so maybe it depends on what year you're saying that you were.
It does, I think.
Okay.
Harry
so maybe
Owen is a good example
about this, but okay.
And I have answered.
I'm not saying that nobody ever felt like they didn't understand what was happening, but it does seem a little bit shocking to me for people not to have been a little bit more knowing about that. I mean, there's people now who say, "I never even heard of a seer stone. The church lied to me. The church told me there was no such thing as seer stones," and I'm like, "No, it's there." Like, I understand that some people are ignorant.
Well, I think that's like there was a very poor family in Scotland, and their name escapes me. Maybe I can add it later. But they were very poor. I believe he was blind, so wasn't able to work. They sent their two children, their two oldest children. She was 14 or 15, and her little brother, on the Perpetual Immigration Fund to come to Zion. Like the missionaries told them to send them. Right, the little girl gets here, and within just a few months of being in Utah, is married to a older man with many wives. Right, it was 14 or 15. It was very often the story with my great-great-grandmother, very often or great-great-great-grandmother, the unprotected girls whose fathers had passed away, right? So it's like and there was no escape from Utah. There was so it's an interesting thing to consider how these things might apply, because I guess my question is, knowing how God talks about knowing God's reason for always forbidding polygamy is because God cares about women specifically,
and I'm saying just the opposite. I'm saying I think that confusing celestial plural marriage with whoredoms, kidnapping, and violence, I think is a very, very big difference. And then we have to. And were these people doing something evil? Definitely. There's one thing I think that I definitely agree with you on in the context of Jacob 2. Jacob 2 was a situation where a prophet was getting up and condemning wicked people. Okay? And I just think that when you're a prophet and you get up there to condemn wickedness and to say, this will not be allowed anymore, we're putting a stop to this wickedness, I would just say that in the context of the scriptures, never, ever is that the time to introduce to them a higher, more celestial law. You don't take the most wicked, most violent, most disobedient people and say, you're now worthy of a higher law. You've been living this polygamous society for thousands of years, but now I'm going to give you this high revelation. I'm going to reveal to you what celestial marriage truly is. No, he's condemning wickedness. Now, you and I might disagree on what that wickedness is, but I think we both agree that he's condemning wickedness. He's not revealing higher truths to an enlightened people who are prepared for the higher law, right? He's condemning wickedness.
He's reminding people of the laws that had already been given to them. Because if you read the scriptures through, one of the main reasons that Lehi was led to warn the people in Jerusalem and then led to leave Jerusalem was because of the polygamy that they were practicing in Jerusalem.
Right. And I've heard that you don't believe that Lehi was a polygamist then, which I find interesting.
Absolutely not.
Because the context of a guy with an old woman wife who's clearly past the childbearing with 4 adult sons goes into the wilderness. And then as soon as they go back to Jerusalem, because they were told to get wives to raise up seed, all of a sudden he has 2 new children. Only a few years later. I'm sorry, to me, the context makes it almost physically impossible, unless there was a miracle, in which case, why didn't they mention the miracle that somehow Sarah had 2 new children in her old age? It seems pretty obvious to me that she would have taken a second wife there.
So I have an episode that I did on Sariah. I believe it's called Sariah and the Matriarchs plus 2 claims or something like that. I'll put a link to it that covers these exact things. So she had 4 unmarried sons, which means they were all, you can look up the age of marriage in the Jewish context. They were all teenagers, right? And she went on to have 2 younger children. I was pregnant at the same time as my daughter-in-law, twice.
Right, so you can have a big gap, maybe, between the 4 children and 2 more.
Well, and we don't know all of the children. We know Nephi had sisters, their names aren't given. So to claim that Sariah, like we think of Lehi and Sariah as these old people, that doesn't make any sense. They had 4 teenage sons, right, who were not yet married. Their oldest child was not yet married.
Well, they all got married and had children at the same time as the 2 younger children were born. But you're saying that's possible. You can just overlap generations like that.
I did it.
Yeah.
My mom did it. Yeah, I'm the same age as my niece. And it's very common when we're not using birth control. Having a 20 to 25 year gap between your oldest and your youngest, if you continue having children, is not at all unique, especially when you consider I didn't have my first until I was 22. And in this context, that would have been very late. They could have started having children at 18.
And again, I'm not necessarily saying that my interpretation is the only possible one. I think you can reasonably hold the view that you do. I still think that it doesn't make it a great example. To try to say Lehi was a monogamist, I don't see that.
Lehi was had command.
It's possible. You're saying it's possible, maybe, but I don't think it likely. And
he says,
but I don't think it's dispositive either way.
Yeah, and I won't take the time to go through all the scriptures, but Lehi was commanded that they should only have one wife. And if you count that was part of what he was commanded to be brought out of Jerusalem. That was part of the abominations. They had to flee in order to raise up seed, which means raise up a covenant people to God by obeying the commandments that God established. So it says in verse 34.
I think you're reading something into it that isn't there. I don't think that was the commandment. They are violating the commandment of Father Lehi, but I don't think the commandment was monogamy. I think monogamy is entirely out of context for any non-Roman or non-Greek civilization, at least until almost modern times. Polygamy was generally something that happened in almost every culture in the world, and so I don't see it there.
Right, but are those elevated cultures?
It's a modern anachronism we're trying to put in there because we want monogamy.
Slavery happens in every culture. War and genocide happen in every culture.
Make them good things,
prostitution happen in every culture. We're supposed to be a higher, elevated covenant culture that does away with things that are not godly.
And that's why we have celestial marriage instead of polygamy.
Right. And so it's interesting. So can you tell me where in Doctrine and Covenants 132, which was the revelation given by God for this principle, where does it talk about celestial plural marriage?
The whole thing talks
no,
about...
because you said that Joseph condemned constantly polygamy, plural marriage, spiritual wifery. We condemned
because there were whoredoms of various kinds that are justified. So, for example, some of the things people have justified are marriage and divorce, right? They make the law of no effect because they think they can put aside their wife and take another. The law doesn't permit that. So, Jesus talked about this,
So Jacob too explicitly condemns many wives and concubines, having many wives and concubines, which is exactly what the doctrine is called in 132. It's called the doctrine of having the principle and practice and doctrine of having many wives and concubines, right? But it never mentions celestial plural marriage, because I think that when Joseph, every time he talked about it, he used every term he could think of. He lumped it all in together. Having more than one wife is all of these things: whoredoms, adultery, spiritual wifery, polygamy. He lumped it all in, and there wasn't yet the term many wives and concubines. I think that's a term that was invented to try to justify why Joseph condemned everything else. And if it were this
and you're saying you think Joseph
if it were this highest, holiest doctrine called celestial plural marriage, then I would expect that in the revelation God gave about it, it would name it by the correct name. God would know what it was called.
Right, and that's just kind of a term that we, here's the thing that's tricky about these terms, right? You're saying you think Joseph lumped all these terms together, and I'm saying, no, I think you're lumping all these terms together. I think there's a whole lot of distinction between marriage. There's a big difference between marriage and whoredom. There's a big difference between marriage and being a sex slave. There's a big difference between marriage.
Marriage is one man and one woman. Anything different than that is lumped in as adultery, polygamy, spiritual wifery, plural wives.
And to turn the tables on you, where does the phrase one man and one woman appear in the Bible or the Book of Mormon or the Doctrine and Covenants or any scripture? One man and one woman is a modern construct that we are trying to write into the past and say, I think they would have accepted this definition if they'd had it, even though they never wrote about it.
Okay, so I could go to Doctrine and Covenants, several sections, and I could go to Genesis where it says, therefore, a man shall cleave to his wife and none else. A man and a woman should be one, right? The man should leave his father and mother and cleave unto his wife. Doctrine and Covenants 42:22 makes it especially explicit, right? To condemn that it's one and one. I could point to the original 1835 section 101, or the 44, section 109, that says a man should have one wife, a woman should have but one husband, which is a ridiculous attempt to explain it away and say that it's not supposed to be but one. And then we could even go to things like in the New Testament, a bishop was supposed to only have one wife. And that was in the context of knowing that in ancient Hebrew, the word for a plural wife was Sarah, T-S-A-R-A-H is one of the spellings, which actually means adversary, pain, suffering. They knew that having more than one wife brought sorrow because those were the stories that we have. The stories that come from polygamy are not happy stories. And so they said, look, if it's going to be a bishop, he can't have this kind of stuff going on in his family. It's just got to be one wife. We can find a consistent pattern in scripture of following the exact pattern that God established every time he wanted man and woman to multiply and replenish the earth, right? That's what he did with Adam and Eve. That's what he did with Noah and his wife. That's exactly what he did. Lehi, it shows.
Right, and then of course I'm listening to you say this and I'm thinking to myself, yes, marriage is of God, and Adam, polygamist, Noah, polygamist, Lehi, polygamist. You know what I mean? And I feel like what you're doing is you're trying to say, well, you like marriage just enough that you don't love celibacy, but you don't love marriage enough to accept all marriages. And to me, that just seems like a weird place to put on the brakes.
Okay.
Like I see a lot of places where it talks about, I see a lot of places in the scripture where it talks about marriage and how good marriage is and how the union of male and female is this joyous thing, the joy of the bride and the groom. And I see all these. But I see that as meaning God loves that we rejoice, that we love one another, that we build our families. Coming from a polygamous perspective, I never saw any of that as implying anything like monogamy, because I only see monogamy as really existing where somebody, usually with the force of law, out of the barrel of a gun, tells a woman she may not have her children, she may not have her husband, right? That's where I see monogamy. I don't see monogamy.
What does that mean? What do you mean that she may not have her children, she may not have her husband? What does that mean?
That means that, yeah, I say, well, I'm thinking about all the situations where people have tried to forbid a plural wife from having any association with her husband. It's a very misogynist thing, monogamy, in my mind. It tells a woman she can only marry whom I say. You can't marry whom you want. You can't be with your family. Oh. You have to. See, that's what monogamy is. Monogamy is like, no, don't you dare love your husband. We're taking you away and making sure that you can only be the wife of a man who has one wife, and she can only have one husband. And so we're going to come in with our marshals like the U.S. did, or we're going to come in with something, and we're going to try to prevent it. All the way back to ancient Athens, Thucydides had two wives, and they were like, we think you have too much political power, and your wife stood up in forum and spoke, and your mistress went to the home, and we think this is too much political power for you, so we're going to banish you, and we're going to make a new rule that your wife has to stay home and you can only have one of them. And that was the very first law in monogamy, because they were trying to get rid of the political power of a polygamist. And I'm just like, so I'm just, that's where I see monogamy. I see monogamy where political power tells a woman she can't marry the man of her choice.
Okay, so let's break it down just a little bit. So I understand what you're saying about the government coming into polygamous communities and enforcing monogamy. Okay, point taken. But let's separate it out to say when we are talking about what is of God, right? You're saying so let me see if I get this right. Like saying to a woman that a man is taken so she can't choose him is misogynistic and is unfair. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, I think it's unfair to the first wife and the second wife and the man. They want to have a family. They want to do all these things that we talked about in the scriptures being a good thing, which is marriage, as far as I can tell. Building families, having love, raising children in the gospel, all that sort of thing. And you're saying, no, you're not allowed. Why is she forbidden from having the same blessings?
So you're kind of lumping things together. I'm just wanting to talk about the principle of saying. Right.
Well, you lump together terms that I think are separate, and I lump together things you think are separate, I guess.
Okay, I guess I'm talking about the force of the state breaking apart. Like if we're talking about polygamy and the idea that a woman can't just choose any man that she wants because some men are taken. That idea you're saying is misogynistic and is unfair. A lot of people say this to me, like, how selfish are you when there are all of these single women to say, no, you can't have my husband, he's taken, right? Is that kind of what you're saying?
Largely, I think that marriage, this is a particularly sensitive one, but in all family dynamics, in all economic dynamics, there's always there's either selfishness or selflessness. And I do think this does play into the selfishness side of it, is that oh, I don't want to provide for more than one wife. I mean, that's a lot of work. Why would I want another one? You know, so there's a lot of men who are very anti-polygamy because it just sounds like too much work. I can't have that much love. I can't have that much resources. I can't have that much time. There's plenty of women who might feel the same way. Look, my husband has only got enough time for me, and I do not want to have to share that time or share my space with anyone else. But all those arguments go way beyond just marriage. It's also with children. I mean, you've got a lot of children. That divides your time and resources thinner and differently than it would be if you had an only child. It just does. That's just a fact of life, you know? And it is true that sometimes that comes with challenges, but it also comes with blessings. It also comes with rewards, you know? And
right.
So which of your children would we want to get rid of if we weren't just monogamous about marriage? We were monogamous about children. And if I were to come to your family and say, you must kick out all but one child. You can only have one person in this type of relationship in your family. Otherwise, it's bad. So if I were to do that, you're like, I'm not going to choose between my children. I'm not going to choose between my wives or my children or my aunts and uncles or my brothers and sisters or any relationship. The difference is that you're treating marriage relationships more differently in many ways than a lot of other relationships. I'm saying, yes, it is different because it's sexual, but it's also, I'm using these other relationships as an analogy to kind of explain where I'm coming from here.
It's a covenantal relationship established by God between one man and one woman. And I always do have to object when people compare wives to children, because women are not children.
Well,
children are born as infants, grow up and move out. Husband and wife are meant to be side by side as equals, different but equals, right? To raise their children. That's the pattern I believe God established, that I think polygamy really twists into this hierarchical.
This is a very, very different, this is a very, very fundamental question. I don't view any ceiling as being equal. It's right. Hierarchical. I do see it all as hierarchical. Yes. Wives to husbands, from husbands to their patriarchal head, through the law of adoption, through the entire kingdom building process is very, very hierarchical in my view. I mean, this is like the relationship between Jesus and his Father. Are they equal? Well, sort of, but Jesus never says, I'm equal to the Father and you should worship me like you worship the Father. No, he says, all the glory be to God. He always defers to the Father and things like that. And I view all of these relationships somewhat in that context. So no, it is true that this is a very fundamental difference. I don't view any covenant, including marriage, as being like the meeting of the minds of two equal partners. I think that kind of undermines the whole concept, I think, of a covenant. If I was merely the exact same equal partner with my spouse in a marriage, then it couldn't have an exalting effect, which I think is the whole doctrine of sealing. The whole point is that I'm connected to my patriarchal head, and she's connected to her patriarchal head. And sort of like a human chain, we grab each other, link ourselves, linking our generations, linking our priesthood authority, linking our covenant relationships. And that those links go all the way back up to God the Father and all the way down to us. Otherwise, we wouldn't be tethered to that divine union, that divine covenant, and we'd just be out on our own. And that's why I use the human chain analogy. Like if someone's being washed away by a flood, everyone says, grab hold of my hand, and you grab each other's wrists, and you make this human chain, and you reach out into the flood, and you grab that person on the end. That does no good at all if there's no one on shore hanging on, right? And I view this idea of this equal partnership marriage thing where you've got, it's just two different heads of the family. We're all equal. We don't have this hierarchical relationship as being like two people out there in the flood being like, oh, no, we don't need to grab onto the hand of anyone who's going to bring us back to God. We'll just be over here. And they're going to get washed away. And that's why I believe that certain covenants or bonds don't exist beyond death. Why? Because they're not connected beyond death to the source of eternity, God. That's why you have to be connected to the covenant.
To use your analogy, especially how God establishes it, I see if we want to use the standing on the shore and holding hands, like the man's holding this hand, the woman's holding this hand, they're also holding each other's hand. And when we have God and the woman and the man in a partnership, it's a pretty solid and right. You're not because what you described is why we get like Brigham Young's. What did you say?
You do need God in the partnership.
I said that. Yeah, I think God holding hands with, I like knowing I'm connected to God. Brigham Young's and the polygamist doctrine is that the man is the woman's God. Her husband is her God. That's taught quite clearly, that she hearkens to her priesthood head as he hearkens to God, right? And that was in
thus making a chain, right?
And that's making a chain, which I think, which I completely disagree with. I think that's very, very flawed, because I know my connection to God, right? And also that's where we get like Brigham Young's trading up doctrine, where if you can find a man of a higher priesthood to take you as a wife, you can, like, you don't even need a divorce. You can leave your husband and go trade up to a higher authority, right? So I think that's very strange when, just as you said, Jesus covenants with us, each of us individually, which you said is a polygamist covenant. But I do agree that Jesus covenants with each of us individually, or at least is connected to each of us. I just don't think it's a sexual, sexual
it's the sexual implication. So in other words, you're totally comfortable being polyandrous, so long as you recognize that sex is not happening with you and Jesus. Sex is only with you and your husband. Right? But you're all married to him. He's part of your marriage covenant. It's just that he's the non-sexual partner, right?
No, the marriage covenant that is compared to the bride and the groom is Jesus with the church. And there's one church, and if you're not one, you're not mine. But okay, let me ask you this question.
But I mean, if he's a part of your marriage, if God's a part of your marriage, you're either in a hierarchical covenant or an equal covenant. Are you equal to God?
No, I am covenanted to God, and my husband is covenanted to God. And my husband and I are covenanted to each other under God.
So you're both the plural spouses of God. Not that you have two husbands, but that you're both the spouse of God.
My husband is not in a homosexual relationship with God.
No, I didn't say sexual. I just said marriage. That's not the same thing.
God created the marriage covenant between Adam and Eve, between the man and the woman under God, right? So we're both connected to God, and God makes us connected to one another individually as a partnership of one and one. But I do have a couple of questions I wanted to ask you, and then you go ahead and ask me questions. So with Brigham Young's doctrines, what things that Brigham Young taught, or what of Brigham Young's doctrines do you not agree with, or would you disavow or take issue with?
Right. I think the main things that there's a lot of things I would disagree with Brigham on. I think we could debate, which brings up an interesting point. In a lot of religions, a lot of churches, there's this idea that you do not question your leaders, that you're supposed to be in or out, that you have to do what they say. This is something I found issue with in the mainstream LDS church. I wasn't comfortable with. I believe that debate, open debate, robust debate is necessary. It's important. It's valuable. We should have that
constantly. Completely agree.
And so, like in my church, for example, in Christ Church, I've disagreed with people. I have raised my hand in our solemn assembly, in our general conference, while the president of the church was speaking, and said, actually, I think you're wrong about that. I think what you mean is this, but your implication is wrong, because it could imply this thing, and I think that's false doctrine. And I corrected him from the congregation in the middle of conference. And he said, and
that's why you're only a 70 and not an actual apostle. I'm just kidding.
And he says, you know what? Thank you, Brother Benjamin. You've got a good point there. And he, worked it in, because that's something that we believe we can do. We should be able to talk about these things. We have to be able to debate them. So I think that there'd be a lot of times when Brigham Young and I would be sitting around and we would disagree vehemently, especially about policies, especially about methods. Okay, I think that there were a lot of things that were very, very difficult that he was faced with, that I don't know if I would have done better, because I wasn't there. And I don't know if and maybe it's because hindsight's 2020. And I'm like, actually, I can totally see a better option. Is it strength of character that I actually would have done better than him had I been placed in the circumstances with the same knowledge? I don't know, honestly. I do know one thing. I am a pacifist. I have long been a pacifist. My family comes from a long line of pacifists. Before they were Mormon, they were members of the Church of the Brethren, the Bavarian Church of the Brethren. That's one of the, it's similar to the Amish or the Mennonite traditions, right? It's an Anabaptist tradition. And pacifism is like one of the first and most fundamental articles of faith in those churches. And we brought that with us right into Mormonism. And John Taylor, for example, was a vegetarian and a pacifist. This is one of the reasons why he did not do more to fight the marshals and things like that. It was because he did not believe in opposing violence with violence. He believed in turning the other cheek in a pacifistic understanding of that. And I feel very strongly about that as well. So one of the major things I would have had a big difference with him on is that there were many instances where he took a really they called him the Lion of the Lord, right? And stuff like that. He was a bit bellicose. He was always talking about like, oh, we should fight to the last man. And I don't even like Onward Christian Soldiers being in the hymn book.
He had very violent rhetoric, exceptionally.
I don't like the rhetoric.
Yeah.
I'm a pacifist. I'm literally an avowed pacifist because I've taken a vow of pacifism. When I was struggling with, oh my gosh, does the church have it? To go all the way back to that, I explored not only every branch of Mormonism, I also explored Vajrayana Buddhism. Well, all the yanas of Buddhism. Theravada or Hinayana Buddhism, Mahayana Buddhism, and Vajrayana Buddhism. And at the time, I took a vow of nonviolence. And I mean, and I remember when I was 18, and you have to register for the selective service, right? At the time, at least, you were supposed to fill out a postcard from the post office to register with selective service. And I wrote conscientious objector in all caps across the form when I sent it in. And I could have just not sent a form. But I was like, no, I want them to know. I will not be. I do not believe it is right for man to kill man. I won't do this. And so that's been a strong thing for me. So I'm sure I would have disagreed with him on all kinds of stuff that ended up being encouraging violence. Partly because I think it's ineffective. I think if the saints had been far more John Taylor's viewpoint, or John Taylor been able to actually preach more of this, I think that we would have been far better off if we had simply said, we are passively resisting. We're not going to comply. We don't believe in your authority to destroy our faith. We're simply going to live our lives, and we're not going to allow you to do this violence to us, But instead, turning the other cheek for a lot of those pioneer saints really just meant submitting to a lot of abuse, I think. And I think it would be a lot better for them to say, no, we're not going to be model prisoners because we don't recognize your authority to imprison us. They should have, you know what I mean? They should have marched every single man, woman, and child in the entire territory into the state house and said, we are guilty of polygamy. If you want to arrest us all, go ahead. But we do not recognize your authority to do this. And we know you cannot house and feed every single person in this entire territory. So you're going to back off and admit.
Well, they weren't all polygamists. Only a small percentage were. But yeah, I hear what you're saying.
I would have done sit-ins, man. But this is hindsight being 2020. Okay, I would have done. I would have staged sit-ins. I would have staged. I would have had us all like lay down in the roads in front of them and say, "Oh, so you want to wipe us out? Drive over us. Drive over us with your carriage. See if you can get your horses to trample us. Because I'm not going to just go where you tell me to. Because you do not have the authority to destroy my people." That's the way. So
they should have done the sit-ins against Brigham Young, or you mean against the federal?
Oh, mostly against the federals. Yeah. So most of the complaints against Brigham Young are violent rhetoric, and I'm saying if I had been Brigham Young with my hindsight, I would have been the greatest pacifist voice in the world. I would have been like, "Oh, Johnson's army thinks they're coming, huh? Well, we don't recognize that men with guns are an army with legitimate government power. We think that you're a bunch of thugs. So we're going to make sure the whole world knows that you're a bunch of thugs and murderers, and we are not going to comply."
Okay. So if we go to some specifics, because I think this is an interesting question. I'm assuming that with Adam God, with polygamy, you very much side with Orson Pratt, and you believe his scriptural justifications for it, because that's
I've found some exceptions to some stuff written in the Seer a few times, right? I mean, his rules of family or whatever. It's all a little bit weird. Some of that, I don't think that everyone has to follow that like it's scripture. But do I believe in polygamy? Yes. I mean, in general, I think
Orson Pratt's defense of it. Okay. And so, but when it comes to Adam God, I'm guessing you would side with Brigham Young, not Orson Pratt.
Here's an interesting point. I think, and I know you're not going to like this, but I think I side with Joseph Smith on the Adam God doctrine. You mentioned the Joseph Smith Papers Project, for example, and Joseph Smith clearly, directly teaches Adam God in there, besides the fact that you've got things like Section 27. In 1830, you've got Joseph Smith preaching Adam God. I see it lots of places in Joseph Smith. So
who was out of step with Joseph Smith? Was it Brigham Young or Orson Pratt? Who was out of step with Joseph Smith on Adam God?
Both a little, but more Orson Pratt than Brigham Young.
Okay, so Joseph
does everybody have their own interpretation slightly? Yes. I consider myself more of a Joseph Smith Adam God believer than a Brigham Young Adam God believer, because I think that he took it to some strange places intentionally to make his point, but I think he was a bit exaggerating some things and maybe more offensive. Brigham Young was taking it a step further in some ways than Joseph Smith did that people found offensive. So, for example, Brigham Young emphatically stating over and over and over again that the Adam God doctrine means that Jesus Christ was conceived through sexual means.
By Adam God.
That is too much to say that Mary had to have had sex with God. I can see why people find this shocking. That's why he said it. He was frustrated that people were rejecting very simple, straightforward things like the idea that we are children of God or descendants of God, or that God is our Father. He found it frustrating, I assume, and he was a very emphatic preacher. And so he went ahead and jumped into full offense mode plenty of times. And I understand that a lot of people find that deeply offensive because he's talking about God being a sexual being, that God engages in sexual
I call it divine incest is my way to describe it.
Incest? Really? Why is that?
Divine incest, right? If God is the
Because
Father,
they're both of the same family as God. I mean, like, we're all children of God. Like, if I marry anyone on this planet, I'm married a child of God. I mean, if I have sex with any human, they're a child of God. Is that divine incest?
No.
No, okay.
Claiming that God had sex with Mary. Claiming that God
Why
had
would that be
sex.
more divine incest than me marrying another human? I mean,
the whole point I thought that was pretty clear, but that's anyway, we don't have to go into it. I thought it would be more clear. So, okay,
no,
so you would side.
Sorry.
So for you, Joseph Smith.
God's a human, Mary's a human. They both come from the same divine origin. They're humans. That doesn't make it incest.
So God, in the Adam God theory, God is not the creator?
Well, of course he is. Yeah. I mean, the whole point of Adam is that he's the beginning of all men, right?
So God, the Father.
Our ancestor.
Right? God is the father of us all, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So in section, so the places that Joseph Smith taught it, section 27, and where else? Where else did Joseph Smith
where else did he mention? I want to say that there's a mention in 107. You know, I could probably pull up some stuff. Personally, I think there's tons of Adam God references throughout the scriptures. One of my favorites is actually in the New Testament, Luke chapter 3, the last verse. Don't remember what number that is. It just says directly, Adam is the son of God, is the way that Luke decides to end the genealogy, the concept of the genealogy. Like, why is it that Jesus's genealogy is mentioned, right? It's a way for Jesus to claim divinity, to claim the throne of David, to claim these things, right? So they give a genealogy. And he makes a point that his genealogy isn't some untethered thing from some created being. He wants to make a point. Adam is the son of God. We are of one family with God. And I'm just like, man, you don't get much more direct about Adam God teachings than that. The idea that we are literally descended from God. We're not just his pets, right? God didn't just make a statue of a monkey and be like, be alive, little monkey. He made a little statue of a human, like, be alive, little human. And then God is this creature outside time and space who's not human. He's not a monkey. He's not a man. He's not anything. No, God's a human. Joseph Smith called this the great mystery, right? You go to the King Follett Discourse, which is canonized in my sect as well. You go to the King Follett Discourse.
Oh, it's canonized in your sect? Okay.
Yeah. And you know, and that's all Adam God stuff. The whole thing is basically just Adam God. The whole King Follett Discourse.
So let me jump back to Luke 3. So for you, when it says Adam was the son of God, that's the same as saying Adam is God.
Sure. In fact, I think that even the Pharisees said the same thing of Jesus when he said, I am the son of man, or I am the son of Adam. They said, what, you make yourself equal to God? That was their great blasphemy. They were so angry at Jesus for going around saying, I am the son of man. And they're like, you make yourself equal with God if you claim to be the son of God.
Because they thought he was claiming to be the Messiah, right?
Well,
and Jesus is God.
Well, yes. But what do we usually call Jesus? Jesus is God. Jesus is God. What do we usually call him? We usually call him the Son of God, which is the same thing as to say that he is God. Yes. Because
we believe that, like, the idea of the Godhead includes Jesus and God, right?
Sure.
So, but there's a difference because you're not saying that Adam is the son of God. You're saying Adam is Jesus's father. Adam is God the Father.
Sure.
So that wouldn't be.
But Adam is also the Son of God. This is the plurality of God's concept that's pretty popular in Mormonism. Once again, I'm going back to patriarchal hierarchies. Which you didn't seem to like when we were talking about it in terms of marriage. Does God have a father? Of course he does. There's no son in this world who does not have a father. There's no father in this world who does not have a child. That's what makes you a father. That's what makes you a son. So if
Adam
Jesus,
being the
Jesus'
son of God
father is the father, then he has to be a son as well.
Okay, so Adam being the son of God means that Adam is God the Father, that Adam is God,
yeah.
God the Father, but Adam as God did not have literal intercourse with Mary. Am I understanding where you are on that?
Oh, no, I just think that it's highly blasphemous to make a big point about this. The scriptures are silent on exactly how they had sex. I don't know why this upsets people so much. But, in vitro, by the power of the Holy Ghost, or who knows what else that means, is all we're really given in the scriptures. And this
so
is where
you don't think that Brigham was wrong about it? You just think
I don't think Brigham is wrong about us being of one family with God. No, I think we are.
I'm saying you don't think Brigham was wrong about the literal conception. You just think he shouldn't have taught it. He shouldn't have said it. Am I understanding? Was he wrong?
Oh, right, because you're asking, because you're trying to put this in the context of what would I disagree with Brigham on. And I'm mostly saying I disagree with him on his method. If I had been president of the church at the time somehow, I'm sure I would have come across very differently. I'm not saying that I'm not saying that I don't think God is a sexual being. I do think that God had children. That's why we're here, because we are the children of God. So that implies life presupposes sex. I'm afraid, for all of our type of creature. I mean, I know there's such a thing as asexual reproduction, but generally speaking, for mammals, life implies sex. And God created all life. God created this. God created us. And how do I think that happened? Well, I think that but I do think that there's a point that you don't necessarily put this in front of the child. I'm not really in favor of telling a child with a weak understanding about the Cabbage Patch or the stork. I think that that's too far in the euphemism range. But I also don't think that throwing it in front of a congregation and being like, deal with it, believe it, or you're going to hell, it would have been my method. Okay. If I got his shoes.
I find it interesting because in Mormonism, as I'm sure you know, like Joseph F. Smith, Bruce R. McConkie vehemently disagreed with Brigham Young about Adam God doctrine. But
depends on which points,
But they did completely agree with him on the literal intercourse and literal conception of Jesus between God the Father and Mary.
Well, and I think that's important.
I didn't realize those were different things. I thought that was Adam God doctrine, and that's the part I find offensive. So
that's the part you find
interesting
offensive. Okay. Well, and I guess here's the thing, though, is I do believe that it is important. Even Catholics who believe Jesus was a celibate and that he was conceived without sex, for example, I think it is still important that we do agree that Jesus was actually the Son of God. If he was just the son of Joseph, it gets pretty dicey,
There's a problem. Okay. So divine origin, but the question
has to have a divine origin in order to have a divine nature.
Yeah. Okay. So divine origin, but so for you, so Adam God is divine, is what I would call divine incest. I know you took issue with that, but
I don't see how that's incest unless everything's incest. I mean,
Okay, so it was literal conception, but it just doesn't need to be taught over the pulpit. Okay, so do I have that?
Yeah, you're asking about what I would disagree with Brigham on, and so probably what you're trying to do is find something that I would disagree with Brigham on that's really central. And I generally support Brigham, John Taylor, Wilford Woodruff, Joseph F. Most of these guys' teachings, I generally support them.
The LDS Church,
I accept.
So the LDS Church has disavowed all of Brigham's doctrines that I consider.
Oh, I know, it's terrible.
Right? Yeah. So I'm trying to see. So I'm trying to see where we would be. Except, and we have, like President Hinckley, as I said, condemned polygamy, but it's the only one we still are holding on to theoretically, right?
Well, yeah, in sort of in practice, but only if people have extra divorces or extra deaths.
Exactly.
Right, which is why I was joking about, like, what does the church just loves death and divorce or something? Because they, but no, when you look at it, okay, so what are the biggies that people blame Brigham Young for that I still think are Joseph Smith, and you and I disagree on that, but like plural marriage, yes, I accept it. Adam God, definitely accept it. Consecration, the United Order, accept it. Gathering, literal gathering. Our church practices that as well. We believe in literally gathering to one place where we can live consecration and plural marriage.
Where is? Can I ask where your gathering place is? What?
Yeah, it's in Nevada. In Central Nevada,
Okay.
we've got a temple there and a big gathering place. We also have church meetings in Spanish Fork every Sunday. So feel free to stop by any old time.
What would happen if I came to one of your church meetings just to come experience?
You could come to church and just be at church. It's not as different as you'd think, probably. We don't have multiple wives here every week. We don't talk about it very often, frankly. It's the thing outsiders want to talk about. Outsiders want to talk about polygamy because it seems so scandalous because it's outside their normal experience. But really, again, the gospel is this symphony of doctrines, all of this stuff going on. And polygamy is this one little detail that I don't see it as radical. I don't see it as that weird. But even in our polygamist church, it's not like you would see polygamy very often. How many families have more than one wife at a time in the family right now? Like, if I can't count anybody who's died, whose spouse who was plurally married, but now a spouse has died, or they were plurally married, but now a spouse has divorced them, or if I can't count anything except people who are currently sitting there on the pew in church, holding hands with wife in this hand and wife in that hand right now, kind of thing. Well, shoot, that's not very much of our church either, right? It's not like that's everybody.
It's necessary for exaltation.
We believe
that's what was taught by Brigham Young and John Taylor and Joseph F. Smith. Absolutely, all of them.
I'm going to say yes, and because I want to clarify. Okay, yes, of course, it's essential for exaltation. But what is it that I'm agreeing is essential to exaltation? Am I saying that this life, this mortal world, has to always
being open-hearted toward it, being open to it?
Yeah, well, certainly, because, for example, the whole idea of Eve and Sarah and Lilith and Mary all being married to the same man in Brigham Young's way of discussing this. There's the idea that, well, he didn't marry them all at the same time. If God were this kind of polygamist, he didn't marry them all at the same time. So when we say that we have to be open to polygamy, we're not talking about this life, or at least not this life only. We're talking about the idea that God is an expanding being. God is always creating worlds without end, right? That also means children without end. That also means friends without end. That also means aunts and uncles without end. That also means trees and mountains and worlds without end. But it also means wives without end. God is not done taking plural wives.
Why doesn't it mean husbands
expanding his kingdom?
When I read the scriptures, God created one man and one wife, told them to be together with none else. So why does it? And you keep applying it, comparing it to everything else. So why isn't it husbands without end?
To some extent, it is. But the one thing that comes up in this patriarchal viewpoint of polygamy is that that's why there's this hierarchy, and that leads into some of the stuff that is oft abused and totally misunderstood that you were hinting at, or at least trying to, or maybe accusing at earlier when you were talking about like a woman taking another husband because he's higher in authority, right? Now, again, I'm not talking about what I believe is a sexual thing. Okay, that's where we end up getting into a big argument. I'm talking about a theological idea of the nature of God. God's love is expansive and never ending. There will never be a time when he does not have more love for more people, for more creation, for more, right? And as he does that, God himself, God as an idea even, grows because it's ever more creation. And the difference is that we just don't view, we view marriage as a great analogy for all kinds of relationships rather than uniquely different from all other kinds of relationships.
See, I view it as uniquely different from all other relationships.
And I think that marriage is a great. I think the reason why marriage is constantly used as an analogy for all of these covenants is because there are certain similarities between all of them.
Okay, and to me, see, I think polygamy devalues marriage, and that's part of the like comparing it to every other relationship. It's just like everything else; it devalues marriage, right? And so I think that.
I think just the opposite. I think monogamy is telling, oh, we don't like marriage. You better stop that marriage business. You're married too much. Oh, no more marriages for you. We don't like marriages. Let's get rid of them.
Right. But you have to acknowledge that, like people who advocate for homosexual marriage say the same thing. You want people to be married, so let us be married, right?
Well,
So you could use that in any way. I have a definition of marriage that I think is sacred. And when we change the definition of marriage by adding additional wives or adding additional husbands, I think it ceases to be the covenant that God established. But I
think biblical marriage, covenant biblical marriage, like Moses at Sinai or Jesus and the church or any of these, those are all polygamous marriages, are the prime example that are being used. And so, yes, I do believe that biblical marriage matters. Like I don't want to oppose gay marriage legally because I don't think the church is the government. I don't think the government is the church. I think separation of church is a good thing. Yeah. And if their religion, if their homosexual LGBTQ club wants to say this is how we define it, then I think that they should have the legal allowance to believe as they believe.
Smaller government is better.
Do you know what I mean?
Okay.
But that's not the same thing as to say that I think that qualifies as a marriage. But I also don't believe that this equal partnership monogamy idea, I don't believe that's a marriage either. I don't think it's biblical. I don't think it's covenantal. I don't think it'll exist after death. I think it's about the same as a gay marriage. Yeah. You can make whatever promise you want about how we're going to be equal gay partners or we're going to be equal heterosexual partners. And I see the same thing. I see people untethered from a covenant with God. And if you don't make that covenant with God, then you can make whatever promises you want in this life. You can live as you want to live. I believe in freedom. Go for it. But I don't believe that it has an eternal bearing on exaltation. And that's why I believe, yes, okay, so it's essential to exaltation. But does that mean that someone who's totally unmarried is somehow like less favored in the eyes of God? I mean, no, I don't see it that way at all. I just think that if we want to be like God, we have to be open to becoming like him. In other words, having infinite love, having infinite forgiveness, having infinite growth, having infinite creation.
Sure. But none of that implies sex with additional partners. But so let me ask you. So
sex is one way by which we create children.
Your church is the one church with the keys to perform genuine eternal marriages. So only the president of your church is the one man in authority who holds the keys.
We do believe in the one man doctrine. I do think we view it a little differently than some do. A lot of people want to make keys about excluding. I think keys are about including. Keys are about opening locks. Why do we use this term? What does key mean?
Well, I'm asking you in the context of you saying that like my husband and I won't be, our marriage isn't lasting. You know, like we're married. We've only ever been married to each other. We have 13 children, but it's cute that we're doing it, but it's not real marriage. So I'm curious about
unless you're actually unless God is part of that covenant. Yes. And I think the way that happens is hierarchically through things like the endowments where you covenant to obey your husband and he covenants to obey the father.
Okay.
That's
happened in your temple exclusively, I'm assuming, right?
Which does happen in our temples. Here's the thing that's tricky. When it comes to exclusivity, though, not so much. Let me explain to you what I mean. Keys, it'll take me less than 5 minutes. Keys are meant to unlock things. That's why we use it as an analogy. Again, these things are all metaphors. A key is not a physical key anyway. It's a metaphor. So what's a metaphor for? Well, I would say that the mainstream LDS church and most of our understandings in this generation have been polluted by this idea that a key is something not that liberates, but something that locks things up. The idea that it's exclusive. I exclusively have the keys, says the president of the LDS church. Therefore, you must come to me for permission. So having the keys gives you like administrative authority or administrative control over other people's lives. This is backwards. I believe this is apostasy. This is not appropriate. When we talk about keys, I think about the scriptures like, and he shall come to liberate the captive. He shall come to set us free. Okay. The key is not about locking up the gates of heaven against men, as Jesus accused the Pharisees of doing, locking up the gates of heaven against men. That's the interpretation of keys that a lot of people have. I think that, yes, we have a key holder in the branch, but that has nothing to do with stopping anyone from anything. It has to do with the fact that he has unlocked the gate. He has the power and the knowledge and the practice to help us do as he is doing, which is to come into the presence of God and learn the things of God, receive revelation, become prophets and prophetesses, kings and queens, priests and priestesses before the throne of God forever. That's what a key is. A key unlocks the gate.
Okay, so your president holds the keys and he has unlocked the gate in your temple. So yes. People are all available. It's available to all who come to your temple. Like
all
it's available
who are
to
willing, right? Come and partake freely without money and without price, right?
So it's not exclusive in that you don't say people can't come to your temple, but it is exclusive in the terms of it's available only for those who who make the choice to come.
Who make the choice to actually do it, and I recognize that is difficult. Now, but what are the litmus tests? The litmus tests aren't like you have to pay tithing to us for a year and you have to sustain our leader as the only man on the earth and blah, 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 blah. No, our requirements are things like, do you feel prepared? Let's talk about symbology with you for a while. Let's talk about ritual experience. We mentioned the washings and anointings, which are so important to me at the beginning. I don't want anybody to come into our temple not thinking I am preparing to strip myself of all earthly things. And I recognize that being ritually nude is part of that experience. I don't want anybody to be surprised by the covenants they're going to make. They need to go in there prepared because they want to have that experience. They want to know what it means to approach the throne of God, because only then will it have any meaning. I've sat in that temple with men who have been in the presence of the resurrected Lord Jesus Christ. And I've been in that temple with people who don't even know if they believe if that's possible. And let me tell you, they had different experiences, because those who are prepared to truly sacrifice all things for the greater excellency of Jesus Christ have a different spiritual experience with God than the unprepared who simply go, I don't know, I guess I'll do a ceremony. Well, then all you're going to see is all you're going to get is a ceremony.
Okay. So let me go through my I think I understand what you're saying, and that makes sense. So with blood atonement, how do you interpret that? Or how do you do you agree with Brigham on that? Do you disavow it? How does it look in your belief structure?
I do think that he was in a time of, much like we are now in many ways, there's many claimants, there's many things going on. He wanted to control was a bigger thing for him than it is for me. Right? Okay. That's the same theme. Control was a bigger thing for him than it is for me. At the same time, he was less controlling than the church is now, than Russell M. Nelson is. Russell M. Nelson has a whole church handbook of instructions, of rules. Brigham Young supposedly said, let them come, let them partake or reject with any of the ceremonies of the temple or any of the things of the gospel. Then whether they shall be gods or whether they shall be devils is on their heads, right?
So blood atonement is something that is only necessary when you need to establish control. And other than that, it's not necessary, but it is valid when needed.
I think what he was saying is generally lost on us because he turned it into this violent rhetoric. I think the true doctrine of blood atonement is about the fact that it is through the blood of Jesus Christ that we are saved. That is the true the doctrine itself of blood atonement. There's this sideshow over here that everybody wants to freak out about whether or not Brigham Young is saying violent rhetoric. But the concept of blood, being covered by the blood of the Lamb, being covered, because that's what atonement means. Atonement means covering. To be covered by the blood, to the blood of the sacrifice, and then eventually the blood of Jesus Christ. And how is it that we are reconciled to God? That's the doctrine. And then there's this slideshow over here about, did Brigham Young misapply it? Did Brigham Young misapply the doctrine of the atonement to justify violence? Yeah, I can see that interpretation. Okay. And I think that's misrepresenting it. So I'm not that worried about doing any of that.
Okay, so let me just add this one part. Sorry, I wanted to hear that last part, what you're saying. But Brigham Young wasn't just talking about, because he was explicitly saying repeatedly, and that was repeated by the others that were teaching it, that the blood of Jesus Christ is not sufficient and someone's blood needs to be spilled themselves. And so it's not just talking about the atonement through blood of Jesus Christ. It's saying that is not sufficient. So that's what I'm curious about. Do you say he was wrong on that?
This is the whole works versus grace argument that I think is worth having. And I think that he had some interesting things to contribute to that discussion if we took him in the proper context. He's generally not accepted in that proper context. The general context is, how do we receive the blood of Christ? Is this free grace so all-sufficient that we need not even know the name of Jesus Christ? We need not even exercise any faith in him whatsoever? Or are we saved by faith? Or what does our faith lead us to works, which are baptism and things like that? Well, when he also had the context about execution. Execution at the time was by hanging, where their blood was not shed. And it says explicitly in the Bible multiple times that we are not to strangle our meat. We're not to be strangled. That is a shameful thing. There's some weird stuff in there, okay? Brigham Young was into this stuff.
Hanging the cows to butcher, or the steers to butcher them. I think it was.
there was that going on,
firing
right?
squad, because he said that their blood needed to be spilled on the ground.
So the debate that they were having, if you want to get to the context of Brigham Young, wasn't about whether or not we should execute people who are murderers. No one in America, as far as I'm aware, was saying murderers should go free. Heck, even pacifists weren't really talking.
He wasn't talking about murderers. He was talking about adulterers and many others. Peter C. Kimball and both
various
of them said,
capital offenses.
Just sinners. It was sinners. Like, you sinners would want to come and have your blood shed. He definitely said it about adulterers, which he didn't include himself as that, even if he married another man's wife, which even Brian Hales.
Because again, what the definition of adultery to Brigham Young would be people who are not people who broke a covenant relationship, not people who entered a covenant relationship. Entering a covenant relationship entering a covenant relationship with God doesn't make you an adulterer. Breaking your covenant relationship with God is what makes you an adulterer.
Well, if you were already married in a covenant relationship to another man, but Brigham had higher keys, so you went in without divorce, instead married Brigham, it's hard to find a biblical definition where that wouldn't be adultery. But in any case, but he was talking about if his wife slept with someone else was one example. That's the famous
that it would be better for them both to have a javelin thrown through their heart, which is interesting because that is a biblical story. There's a biblical story about the sons of Aaron and prostitutes and a javelin being thrown through them both, right? So this is literally in Exodus. That he's deliberately and directly referring to a biblical story. He is not, I believe, saying that we should all kill each other. If you do take it that way, please don't, because that would be the wrong way to take it. That would be false doctrine, and I'm against it. Please don't.
So he was saying he had the authority. Well, and his that people need. Well, he talked about it a lot. Do you love your neighbor enough to shed their blood if they? If it needs to be shed in your mind. So you would say that you don't want to come. This is what I'm hearing, and you can tell me you don't want to come out and say Brigham Young was wrong on that, but you're kind of like, Brigham Young was kind of wrong about that. But you don't necessarily want to say he was wrong. Should we settle it there? Is that kind of accurate?
Well, again, I see. How about it this way? Instead of it being about right or wrong, it's about communion. Are Brigham Young and I both in the same church? Yes. Are Brigham Young and I both in the same religion? Yes. Are Brigham Young and I both recognizing one another's priesthood? I believe that would be yes. What do I do with other people who are in communion with me who I have tension with? Well, I debate with them. I talk to them. I tell them, oh, no, your perspective on this is wrong. We should think about this in this other way, right? That's what the whole Talmud ended up being, was a bunch of rabbis who all recognized each other as legitimate Jews. All these rabbis all said, yes, we're all Jews. But did they agree on everything? No. The whole point is they disagreed on everything so that they could debate and get to a truth. Okay. So I'll debate all day long about blood atonement, and I'll never do it in such a way that tries to place Brigham Young outside the faith. I believe he's...
Okay.
Right? But I'll debate about it with you like I was just doing, saying, look, it's about the atonement of Christ. It's about the blood of the sacrifice. It's not about that. And then you're like, well, what about the fact he said that wasn't enough? I'm like, well, that's really about grace and works. Just to recap our little conversation here. What am I doing? I'm engaging with you the way I would engage with Brigham Young. I believe this open and healthy debate is the way that we should approach these gospel topics, not dispositively say this place is so-and-so outside of the faith or this, right? It's not about drawing sides, because there are no sides. We are all the children of God. We are all Mormons. We're all trying to sort this out. I accept you as part of your religion. I thought you thought I'm going to hell for sure. Like, I've been called the spawn of Satan and Satan's whore. I've been called all kinds of things by a lot of people in your camp. Well, right. And look, here's the thing. I've been impatient and probably rude at times myself, because I think that historical revisionism, of which I believe you're engaged, is, I think, totally counterfactual and therefore very dangerous. That's why I think it's good to have. Do I think that you could drive people away from Mormonism? I think you will make more atheists, bitter, angry atheists. I think you'll make more bitter, angry atheists with your YouTube videos than you will make believers, especially happy believers. And is that good?
That's not been my experience, just so you know.
I think that's bad. But that doesn't mean I'm saying you're outside the faith. You're still trying to be faithful. Okay. You're trying to find a way to do it, and you're debating on the far end of these debates. And I'll just debate with you all day long. That's fine. And you're still in communion as far as I'm concerned. But I do see a lot of Mormons leaving the faith. A lot of people are just in droves right now. They're not coming my way either. They're not joining Christ's church. But like hundreds of thousands of people are leaving the mainstream LDS church in droves.
Have been for decades.
And the vast majority of them, almost all of them, a statistically insignificant number of them are doing anything other than becoming bitter, angry atheists. Very few of them become Christians.
I don't know that they're all angry.
Don't become anything.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. It's been happening for decades. And I think I know several of the reasons why. So, okay, so blood atonement, I'm in the same camp as Brigham, whereas I'm wrong, but that like Brigham isn't not the prophet and he's not out of the faith because he was wrong on blood atonement, but he was wrong on blood atonement. And you would like to engage with him on it if you had that chance. Like, just like Orson Pratt did with Adam God.
Because in hindsight, if he could see how badly his words have been taken and what they've been used to justify and what his words have been used to do. I mean, he was even beginning to see it even in his own life. There was plenty of problems. It was like, oh man, this is out of control.
We had Mountain Meadows and many Mountain Meadows.
Supposedly, I mean, and people disagree on how much Brigham felt about this because even Brigham said things on both sides of his mouth on this too. Brigham said, vengeance is mine, saith the Lord, and I've taken a little at one point, sounding like he totally approved. And at other times he said, what you did was wrong, and I told you to leave him alone. And
Okay, so we can. I think we've tons of that one much. So now, race. Let's talk. So Brigham said in the name of God that he knew slavery was a godly principle and was correct, and then also the whole.
You did just admit it. It is in the Bible.
Yes, it is. I do. So okay, so you agree with Brigham on like the inferiority of Black people in the premortal existence, that they were less valiant?
You know, the funny thing is actually the strongest statement we have against the theory that you just mentioned is Brigham Young. The church leaders after Brigham Young, all the way up to and even including Spencer W. Kimball at times, they all said what you were just saying, that they were inferior, that they were less faithful in the preexistence, all that sort of thing. Brigham Young actually,
it was definitely Bruce R. McConkie, but
Bruce R. McConkie was big into that. Yeah.
He was the one that held on.
He was bigger, okay, but like this is more or less the doctrine of the church all the way through. Brigham Young himself actually disavowed that. He said there were none unfaithful in the premortal life. All took sides. That it doesn't matter if you were the president of the church and a prophet in the preexistence, or whether or not you were a. He didn't say the bad N word, but he said the Latin N word. Or even if you were Black, basically, they all took sides for Jesus Christ. So Brigham Young actually was not the one who taught that. It was pretty much everyone after him all the way up right into the 70s.
Hold on. That's not true. 1852, we have the
1852, he said some very harsh things about how they were inferior, but he did not say that they were neutral in the preexistence. He did not say
that came later. That was used to justify.
They took the side of Christ.
Well, so Brigham Young did teach in no uncertain terms the inferiority of African Americans.
Right.
And so do you hold to that, and that they could never have the priesthood until after the very last white person had been given the opportunity, till the end of creation?
Right.
So do you agree with him on that? Or have you disavowed and condemned that?
You know, again, I would engage with him on that more than I would say this places him outside communion of the faith. I disagree with him on it quite a bit, actually. In fact, one of the big things for me with fundamentalism is fundamentalists generally don't have Black priests, right? There's
fundamentalists generally hold to all of Brigham's teachings. That's why I'm asking.
Yeah. And that was a big hang up for me because I was like, I don't think I could go fundamentalist. It's one of the main reasons why I wasn't that interested in any of the fundamentalist groups when I was having my own journey, was that. Because I was like, I'm not going there. In fact, I was this close. When I found out in the 90s or so, I was still a kid. But when I found out in the 90s that any member of the church had ever believed in any racist doctrine, I was this close to saying there is no God, there is no church, it's all BS. I am done.
Oh, interesting. I want to point out you almost became an angry atheist, and it had nothing to do with my podcast. So let's just pause on that. Okay, keep going. Okay.
But one of them was over this doctrine, right? This was a big no from me. I don't want to be associated with racists at all. Okay, and Brigham Young was a racist, and so here I am associating myself with Brigham Young, even though he's a racist. I would engage with him because I do believe in doctrines of lineage. I don't believe that translates to race.
Doctrines of lineage. Can you define that?
For example, that the Levites are Levites and the non-Levites are not Levites. The Cohens are Cohens and the non-Cohens are not Cohens.
So there are different gifts and
different gifts and blessings that come from your lineage.
Okay. Okay. All
right? This is all over the Doctrine and Covenants even. This would be hard to extricate Joseph Smith from.
Okay, but it
my
is
goodness,
really
she's
hard
got
to
strawberry everything. My daughter is showing me she's got strawberry bagel with sliced strawberries with strawberry lemonade. Okay.
So it sounds to me like you don't ordain black men.
We never have, but no black man has ever come to us to verify whether or not his lineage entitles him to the priesthood or not. No black man has ever asked for ordination.
So you would do a blessing, a patriarchal blessing, to determine whether the lineage entitles him to the priesthood.
Yeah. And so here's one of the differences too. Brigham Young started this. This is something I definitely disagree with him on. Brigham Young started this idea that everyone has to be ordained. Everyone goes to the temple. Everyone gets ordained. Every man over 18, heck, for Brigham Young, every man over 12 gets ordained an elder or a 70 or an apostle. Sometimes when they're just babies, right? They ordained everybody. This is why it became so racist, because it was everybody except you. We don't do that. We don't ordain everybody. We only ordain people when there's been an actual revelation calling them by revelation to be ordained to something. I didn't get ordained in my church because I was just some guy. We don't ordain every guy. There was a revelation. Thus saith the Lord, I shall call my servant Benjamin Shaffer to become one of my apostles, and he shall serve in the quorum of the 70. That's how I got ordained.
Okay,
because
so
I
you don't
felt
get to
my own
choose
personal call.
Okay.
I did feel my own personal call from God, and they got the call from God, and then it happened. But there was no assumption that simply because I was a member, I would be ordained even a deacon or anything.
Okay. So just to try to encapsulate this quickly, because I feel like there's some.
So it's not like all of us, but none of you. It's not about race.
Okay. But however, while racism is, I'm super uncomfortable having this part of the conversation, right?
Well, we're two white people talking about black people's destiny, which frankly probably isn't going to work anyway. No matter what we say, it doesn't really matter. We should get a black person's opinion.
Well, I'm asking for your
beliefs. And they can't speak for their whole race either, you know?
Right. I'm just asking for where you part ways with Brigham. So it sounds like in general, you kind of, you believe Brigham's teachings, you would just maybe apply them differently in some instances, but that Brigham's saying that he knows, was Brigham, when he said in the name of God that he knows that racism was, that slavery was of God and that it was good, was he wrong or was he right? Was he being a false prophet in that moment?
Slavery is almost always wrong. You know what I'll give you on this one too?
Almost. When is it not?
Almost always wrong. You know what I'm going to give you
almost. I'm just curious
right here because of the this is a softball for you. Because of the Republican platform. Polygamy is usually wrong too. I'll admit that. I'm a polygamist.
That's my question.
Polygamy is usually wrong too. In fact, a lot of marriages don't turn out very great because we don't ask God to enter into have our covenant with him. No, we're following our lusts. We're following our ideas. I would say the vast majority of plural marriages and monogamous marriages and marriages, period, a lot of them not eternal, not good. Slavery, almost always wrong.
When is the almost? Give me what the qualifier is. You said almost.
When he says to his master, entreat me not to leave thee, please pierce my ear, that all may see from the earring I shall wear for the rest of my life that I am of thy household, for I wish to serve thee. Then
that's because his wife
he's totally free to go.
Leaving,
and he says, I want to be part of your household.
Would mean he would lose his wife and his children because they were still enslaved, but to the master. That's what the context.
Well,
is.
he could stop.
And he was already a slave.
Still have his wife and children. Everybody pays off their own debts is the only way I saw that.
Okay. So there is a qualifier where slavery is okay, just like there's a qualifier where polygamy is okay.
And
so
do you know what the main difference is, by the way, between when I think marriage is okay or at least okay, and slavery is at least okay? You know what the main difference is between marriage and rape? Consent. Consent is where the primary difference is. And so is slavery. Slavery is usually the main point. The main problem with slavery is there is no consent. And I think that the biblical talk about slavery is specifically to point out that serving one another, living together, doing work on the same business or the same farm together is not the sin of slavery. Slavery is not a sin because you worked on the same project together. Slavery is a sin because there is no consent. And so it's an
imbalance of power when one person owns another.
and they're consensual enter their debts, and the Lord always releases them from their debts. The year, not just the year of Jubilee, but the sabbatical year. The Lord is going to release them from those debts. So slavery cannot be permanent. Debt cannot be permanent. And if you wish to have an ongoing relationship, it must be consensual. Well, I don't see anything wrong with those rules, which is what I see in the slavery of the Bible. And so if that's slavery, then I think that's probably appropriate, because I've worked for an employer before. And honestly, my relationship in modern America with an employer has at times been far closer to actual chattel slavery than what the Bible is talking about. Because my debts don't get forgiven every 7 years in this country.
I think that Hagar as a slave, where they owned her body and soul, including the fruit of her womb, they could claim as their own, right? That's a pretty,
I think that's a terrible
slavery.
interpretation of that story. I don't know if I'd go that far.
Sarai says, here is my handmaid, take her that she may bear a child for me. It was going to be her child. Hagar was her slave, and they had sexual access to her, including to claim her child as their own. That's where both slavery and polygamy come from. So my question also is, why is polygamy the highest, holiest principle of the gospel that has to be restored, and not slavery, when they are both intertwined in the same story?
I would say that covenant relationships are the highest and holiest law. And sometimes we mortals will call one of them polygamy, we'll call another one monogamy, we'll call another one
Hagar,
we'll call another one atonement, we'll call a different one receiving the law at Mount Sinai. And all of those, when they're covenant relationships, are good things and of God. And when they're not covenant relationships.
So was Hagar in covenant relationship with
Abraham
Sarah,
and God?
with Sarai and Abram?
I believe so, yeah.
And yet he just abandoned her. God said, okay, the covenant's over.
And this is where I would say, look, Sarah or Sarai and Hagar having a tiff. And Abram not stepping up and helping her during this fight and allowing his family to be torn apart because of these problems.
So Abram was bad in how he handled polygamy.
It didn't go very well. That was bad.
But it was not engaging in polygamy that caused the bad outcome. It was that Abram wasn't assertive enough in how he managed his two wives that led to the bad outcome.
It was also the fact that, don't forget, Sarai has a covenant here that she's trying to fulfill. She's trying to bring forth this blessed covenant son. She tried to do so with plural marriage.
Through Hagar.
Through Hagar. And
it was through concubinage. She was a concubine. It was through concubinage, not plural marriage. 132 is the doctrine of many wives and concubines. So Hagar was absolutely a concubine. She was a slave.
Yeah.
She was every definition of a concubine. That's what Hagar was.
Yes, but what is a concubine? Is
a slave wife.
Still a little bit tricky here, because that still makes her a type of wife. And what happens when you marry your slave, according to the law of Moses, is she's now free. If you slay with a slave,
except that she's treated her still, because Abram preceded the law of Moses. Some of it comes.
Yes, but I believe Moses, just like Joseph Smith, was just a restorationist. Moses was simply trying to reaffirm the law.
Right. But if we're going to look at the story of Abram, which I think sets the example, Hagar remained a slave. When there was a problem between Sarai and Hagar, Abraham recognized Hagar's identity as Sarai's slave and said, you deal with her, she's your slave. Right? And so she didn't enjoy the protection of a wife. She was still.
Well, I will admit, this is the problem. There was broken covenants happening. I don't think the covenant was the problem. I think breaking the covenant was the problem. Abram and Hagar's divine covenant was a divine covenant, and therefore brought forth Ishmael, who brought forth the Midianites and all of and other Arab races. And I believe he was part of fulfilling the promise, the covenant promise of Abraham. But they were breaking the covenant. There was these breakdowns, because in this world, we're not always perfect. We don't always live the Lord's commandments with perfection. And so there was a conflict. And in that conflict, they got taught a lesson. And that lesson was, the angel came and brought her back and reprimanded her mistress, if this is slavery. He reprimanded Sarai and brought her home.
The angel reprimanded Sarai?
and blessed the child that he would not die because she was afraid. So they go out in the desert.
That was later.
Water.
She was kicked out twice. The second time, the angel saved Ishmael's life, and she never went back. And that's when Abram's name was changed to Abraham, and Sarai's name was changed to Sarah, and they became the covenant couple.
So you're saying you don't think that Hagar was there? I mean, because yeah, from my viewpoint, the whole point of this story is that when they learned the meaning of the covenant and they lived in their happy plural family and they learned their lesson to be a good plural family and stop breaking their covenants, they were blessed with the name. He's not just now he's Abraham, not just Abram, because he is because he is the father of the line of Ishmael and the line of Isaac. Now he is the father of nations. Because right, so it's fulfilling. It's so
what's Hagar's new name? What's Hagar's new name?
Look,
Abram and Sarai became Abraham and Sarah.
Just because you don't have something like that in the scripture, just because you don't know, or I don't know that she received a new name, does not mean that we're like. I mean, there's so many people we never mention their wife at all by name. You're right. I don't know.
Okay.
At least I know her name. For goodness sakes, the Bible's filled with wonderful, powerful women who you never even get to hear their name at all. Like.
We better get ready to wrap up. I would agree with you that in the story of Abram and Sarai, it is God teaching us the importance of covenants. And we see them in their best efforts take a misstep, trying to bring forth the promised child. Right,
because you think Hagar's like a mistake or something.
I think that it was. And then when they realized that was a mistake, Hagar never conceived again. She was used as a surrogate, as a slave.
The fact that Hagar's other children aren't listed, you're assuming that means that does that mean Lehi and Sarah never had any daughters? They definitely never had any daughters because they're not named.
Lehi and Sariah. No, it says that they did. The point I'm making is
Adam and Eve had daughters, didn't they? They're not named.
Hold on. It is very explicit that Hagar and Ishmael were kicked out. Abraham was sad that this is where this led, this mistake that they made, trying their best.
Right, and the mistake was kicked out.
It was Ishmael who almost died. It was Ishmael who went on to have 12 sons. So it's very clearly Hagar and Ishmael. There was no covenant. It makes it very clear in both the Book of Mormon and in the New Testament that the bondwoman is not part of the covenant, that only Sarah is. So it's these kinds of things that
I disagree very, very fundamentally.
I could show you, like you look up bondwoman through the New Testament and see where they're talking about we are not the children of the bondwoman. And then also in the Book of Mormon, it says, look to Abraham, your father, and Sarah who bear you, right? It's very clear that it is those two who received the covenant, and their one covenant child was Isaac, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, right? So, but that's my take on it.
Does he get preeminence over Ishmael? Yeah, I see that all over the place. I get that, but I don't think Ishmael is just some dog who gets thrown away. Ishmael received promises and blessings and everything, and that's why the angel was there to proclaim those blessings. And I mean,
so okay,
he's still a blessed lineage. You know,
that story doesn't have anything to do with Mormon polygamy. It's a very strange story to point to claim polygamy is of God, any more than to claim slavery is of God.
Gee, which one of us brought up Abraham anyway? But I'm,
yeah.
But I mean. I do believe in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Moses. And these are a bunch of polygamists. I know that some people say Isaac wasn't. Okay, fine. Kick him out. That's still 3/4 of polygamists of the people who were Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Moses. But, you know, it's like there's a lot of that going on. And look, here's the thing. If it is true that Abraham was accepted of God, if Abraham is not cast off forever, if he's not evil, if Abraham isn't synonymous with the devil and his kingdom, if Abraham has any promise from God, God must be a lot more at least allowing of polygamy than it seems like most people are these days. And at the very least, I would hope that people would make enough allowance for that not to target and harm my family. Please don't throw any of us in jail. Please do not spit on my wives. Please do not chase off my children.
Benjamin, that's creating a straw man. Come on. I would never encourage anybody.
You wouldn't, but plenty of your listeners would.
No, they would not. Not because of any influence. But I will tell you, the way that I am treated by many polygamist or pro-polygamist Mormons is quite appalling. And I have never treated any polygamist that way and never would.
The worst
I've
ever said, even without you present, is that I didn't think you were very sincere because I felt that the overwhelming evidence of the scripture and of history was not in your favor.
Okay.
And I felt that you were making stuff up.
Okay, so
but that does not mean
move on.
that I
want to engage without either of
hard.
us making the victim. Don't make yourself a victim, and I won't make myself a victim. Let's just have a conversation, please.
Sure.
Right? Go ahead.
There's still a history. Okay, there's a history of conflict between polygamous communities and the mainstream of this country in the United States of America, right?
Right, but there's also a history of atrocious behavior by polygamists, specifically to young girls.
And I don't think that look.
And that's something that has to be acknowledged and dealt with.
I know you can pull out some baddies, right? We can pull out Orville LeBaron and Warren Jeffs and a couple.
I think it's not so much the exception as it tends to become the rule to a great extent, because when girls are taught polygamy.
I fundamentally disagree. I think there's more monogamous, child molesting, things like that than there are polygamous ones by a long shot. I don't think it's any more common in our community than it is in the mainstream. Of course, there are bad people who do bad things. There's child molesters, there's murderers, but I do not think that polygamy makes more of them. I think that our religious community is probably exemplary compared to the general population.
I will say, when I was raising my children, and I think I told you this at the wedding, and I'm still raising my children, but I didn't fit in the way I was raising my children without television, without, wanting to raise them up unto the Lord. I did really have a yearning to be among the polygamous mothers to some extent, because I felt like I had a lot in common with them. So I would never say anything condemning to specific polygamists. I have, and people won't believe this, but I have a lot of love and respect. And that's been one of the hardest things about this, has been alienating people that I would not want to alienate.
It sounds like you are saying that you think that our religion encourages violence and evil.
This is what I'm saying. Polygamy necessitates the female marrying age becoming younger and younger and younger. That is verifiable throughout, including in Mormonism during the Great Reformation. The average age of marrying girls got down to like between 16 and 13. It was terrible. And
that is terrible. And my church does not allow anyone to enter a marriage under the age of 18.
Okay. And so we've
had this rule for a long time.
Okay, so just like you guys are concerned that I am being operated on by a false spirit that's leading to bad outcomes, I feel the same way. I am concerned about this, what I consider to be a false spirit of polygamy that does tend also, in many instances, to also lead toward blood atonement, to lead toward racism, to lead toward
right, and that's why you're bringing up all these things, right? Yeah.
Well, I think it's the same group of teachings, that because it comes from Brigham Young. So that's why I'm concerned about it. And I also want women in particular, but men as well, because I think both men and women, in my perspective, can be victims of polygamy. I know that there are lustful men who use it in that way. In fact, D&C 132, the justification is that a man desires to marry another virgin, But I think in general, people believing that this is required by God leads them to do things that I think has a greater tendency to lead to negative outcomes. So that's one of my perspectives, but it's nothing.
And that's my perspective on monogamy in a nutshell.
Right. Sure. So but it's nothing personal. Like, I hope you haven't felt like I've been attacking you in this conversation, or that we're enemies.
No, but we are trying to figure out what the boundaries are, right? We're trying to figure out, where do we agree with Brigham Young, where we disagree with Brigham Young or Joseph Smith or any of the rest of them, right?
Sure. Is that bad?
No, that's good. That's good. It's debate. We should flesh these things out. Heck, we've been fleshing it out for over 3 hours now. I know.
Well, can I ask you this last question, and then you feel free to ask me any follow-ups or final questions. But so one thing, talking about this polygamy forcing the marriage age down for women, it also that's happened throughout. We can show that, right?
It is generally the trend, even in any culture, that generally it's more common for a man to marry. When any marriage occurs, that the man is older than the woman is more common than the woman being older than the man. I think that's partly biological fertility considerations.
Sure, but we're talking about, like, did Brigham Young marry a 13-year-old when he was in his 50s?
That's really crazy, right?
And even according to the stories that I don't agree with, Joseph Smith married 14 and 15-year-olds when he was in his late 30s and 40s, right? So we get
he never got to be 40. They killed him.
Was he within his 30s? Okay, so I guess I'm thinking 44. That's the year, not his age. But so my question is, like to me, things like I just think creation testifies of monogamy, of God's established covenant.
Really?
For example, things like the birth rate being 50-50, just slightly higher male than female because slightly more males die. So how do you think about that? Because I'll tell you what I think about it, but I am curious how you think that fits into polygamy, if God wanted polygamy.
First of all, I think it's interesting because what you're trying to say is that everyone should be a polygamist. Well, that's crazy. Not everyone should be a polygamist. That would be, not only is that numerically impossible, I'll grant you, why would that even be desirable? It's like my other thing about the whole ordination thing. Why would you want everyone in every congregation to be a minister? Well,
doesn't God want us all back? If polygamy is required for exaltation, and even Brigham often taught, and the others, that it was required just for salvation, to not be damned. So if it's required, so doesn't God want us all back? So why teach an exclusion?
God's going to get us all back. I'm a universal.
But we can look at every principle of the gospel, like the commandments, honesty, morality. Like you don't need, it's not like God only wants a certain chosen group of his people to be honest.
Oh, sure. Right. I know. I get what you're saying there. So what you're saying is polygamy like honesty, that everyone has to practice polygamy? No, but because polygamy is only one expression of covenant. Polygamy is only one expression of love. Polygamy is only one expression of family. Does God want everyone to be loved? Yes. Does God want everyone to be covenant? Okay. Yes. Does God want everybody to be in covenant in a particular structure, at a particular time, in a particular way? No, of course not. That wouldn't fit everyone's circumstances. That would be silly.
So is it that Brigham was wrong? And I'm just saying Brigham Young as a stand-in for the entire group teaching these doctrines, Joseph F. Smith.
But you don't include Joseph Smith in that group, do you?
I absolutely don't. So Brigham Young. I do. So Brigham Young was wrong that polygamy is required for exaltation, or God intentionally set up a system where only a select few could be considered to receive exaltation.
This is kind of an identity question, is the way I see this. Is polygamy part of it? Yeah, from my perspective, it is. But does that mean everyone does it the same way at the same time? This is why Paul said, let not the hand say, I have no need of the foot, right? We're all one part of the body of Christ. I view the gospel as one great whole of truth. Is polygamy on the inside of the circle that incorporates all truth? Yes. If you reject any portion of the circle of all things that are part of all truth, I think you put yourself in a situation to be damned. So is it in that sense requirement? Yes. Does that mean everyone does the same thing as everyone else? Absolutely not. There's no reason for the head to say to the foot, I have no need of thee. We're all part of one body of Christ. We're all part of one community. Does that community have some polygamy in it? Yeah, my community does. And I think we're part of the covenant people of Mormonism, or the people of Judaism even, God's covenant people on the earth, the people who worship the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, which, like I said, I see them as a bunch of polygamists. We're part of that. So polygamy is in there, and it's just a fact of life that Jacob, Israel, if we are the children of Israel, that we have to recognize that we come from polygamous ancestry. But does that mean that you have to marry anyone in particular? No. Does it mean I have to marry anyone in particular? No. Does it mean I have to at a particular stage of my life? Oh no, I turned 35 and I didn't have 17 wives. I'm ruined, No, that's all silly. And when Brigham Young took it to that extreme, I think it's hyperbole. It's absolutely ridiculous to a certain extent. Not everyone's circumstances works out this way. Okay, we had a guy, for example, in our church, developmentally delayed, I guess you could call it. He had problems. He wasn't really marriage material. Okay, he wasn't able to have a job. He wasn't able to raise a family.
Sure. But
it was interesting. He was faithful. And he was capable of comprehending these things. And there were moments of lucidity with him that were just inspiring. He would go non-vocal for like lengths of time. And then he would stand up and bear a testimony that was just incredible. And I remember he died somewhat unexpectedly, but it was partly from his health problems, but somewhat unexpectedly. And he was at the temple with me to do a temple session. about a little less than a month before he died. And he looked me in the eye in a way he normally didn't. And he bore his testimony. And that really blew me away. It was like a side of him as like, instead of him just being the guy who sits in the back and you're not sure if he's even hearing it, he was the guy who stands at the front and teaches. And I was like, wow, that was interesting, you know? I didn't expect that from him. And then he was suddenly gone. And after he died, there were some people who had this question. Well, he never married. Will he be able to become a god? Will he be able to be, you know, after all, the whole idea of exaltation is heavenly parents and this family concept of a heavenly father and a heavenly mother. What about him? Can he become like that? Or is he forever barred because he wasn't able to marry in this life? And the president of the church was like, of course he's not barred, right? And he said, let me pray about this. And he prayed about it, and he was sealed to 3 women who also never had the chance to marry in this life.
Okay.
Posthumously.
Okay, so then why practice it in this life?
Is that about sex? No, it's about something much bigger than sex, because all 4 of those people, the man and the 3 wives that we sealed to him in the temple, were all done by proxy. They were dead. It's not for sex.
So, right. So I guess I'm just asking then, why not just let it be practiced that way after this life?
Well, it is practiced that way. And, well, why would after this life be any different than in this life?
Well, you're just saying, because in this life causes a lot of problems for a lot people and causes a lot of pain and suffering.
Okay, so there's a book called The Ghost of Eternal Polygamy.
Yeah,
right?
I'm familiar with it.
I've read it. I thought it was powerful. I thought it was really interesting. I met
Carolyn Pearson.
I met Carolyn Pearson at Sunstone after reading her book. And she was like, oh, you're interested in my book? Well, that's so great. And I said, yeah, because I'm a polygamist. And her countenance just fell. She was like, oh my God. And I was like, yeah, because I'm a polygamist. And this was really insightful to me to see what people think about this. And she was like, what? And I'm like, yeah, I'm a polygamist. And this was really eye-opening to see these perspectives, you know? And she was like, I don't know if she made her really uncomfortable. Kind of like when I met you at the wedding. I'm like, no, this is really fascinating stuff. What do I think about it?
Well, I think my reaction with you in the wedding is because of our personal, I just want to clarify, because of our personal interactions online. They haven't been exactly pleasant, but go ahead. They haven't been
exactly pleasant. I'm like, what are you doing? You're a liar, or something. And then you're like, no, people lied for polygamy. And I'm like, no, they didn't. Anyway, so when I look at the polygamy situation there, what I see is a lot of people, and a lot of these situations that go bad, I see a lot of people who haven't really worked through it. It's like the people who go to the temple unprepared for this ritual experience. It's a terrible, terrible thing to push somebody into polygamy who didn't choose it. That would be terrible. That'd be foolish. Besides being terrible, it's foolish. It's not going to work.
What happened in early Utah was terrible and foolish. How many people?
In many instances, yes. But I think that there were also a lot of great, loving people who said, we want to emulate.
That's my ancestors. My family did it about as well as it could be done. It still involved massive suffering, incredible, unthinkable poverty.
But you're blaming their suffering on their polygamy. And I blame their suffering.
Polygamy that caused the suffering. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't see that as the cause.
When you have one father with 50 children, it's pretty tough.
50? Oh my gosh.
Well, I mean, that's Brigham Young, but he had all of the money because he had all of the tithing funds. And I would have loved to ask you about things like the Gardo House and the culture in early Utah. But I think we better wrap it up. This has actually been great, though. I'm glad we had the chance to do this.
And people like Carolyn Pearson and others who really struggled with this, what I see them is they're in the middle of that grieving process. They haven't resolved it. They haven't gained either a testimony or a rejection of that testimony. I worry a little bit about people who feel that Joseph Smith wasn't a polygamist, that you're in an untenable situation with one foot on sea and one on shore. If you've got a foot on a boat and a foot on the dock and the ship is leaving the harbor, you are either going to pick a side and get on the boat or get on the dock, or you're going to fall in the water, right? And I worry that when people are trying to have Joseph Smith without dealing with the difficulties, yes, the problems, yes, of polygamy, you've got one foot on the Joseph Smith boat and one foot on the monogamy boat, and those are not going to end up being compatible long term. And this is where Carolyn Pearson is, as far as I'm concerned, is that she's struggling. She wants to have Mormonism without its context, without its culture, without its history. She wants to have Mormonism without its scripture. And I feel like you're trying to do the same thing. And the danger there, I think, is that what it is it's like you're right in the middle of this grieving process. You're going through denial, then you're going through anger, then you're going through bargaining. You got to get to the acceptance. Otherwise, you're going to always be in this middle place where it's a trauma. It's a trauma that pulls you apart, pulls your faith apart, pulls your family apart. It causes this terrible suffering. And I feel like because the world isn't always what we want it to be, you got to go through those stages. You got to bargain, you got to be angry, you got to whatever. But in the end, if you don't come to a place of acceptance, it just leads to more and more suffering. And that's where I feel like she's at. That's where I feel like the people in her book were at. That's where I feel like people who deny Joseph Smith's polygamy are at. You're bargaining. You're trying to have Joseph Smith without his polygamy. And I just am like, yeah, but that doesn't come up with historical facts. And so I think that as a fallback, I would advise anybody who doesn't believe Joseph Smith was a polygamist to have a fallback. Is your fallback, I'm going to accept Mormonism anyway, even with the polygamy, even though I don't like it. And I'm going to find a way to accept and wrestle with that. It's okay to wrestle with it. Or am I going to leave Mormonism behind over this and kind of decide now, because that's where it's going to end up, I think, eventually, because I think that it's an incontrovertible historical fact that Joseph Smith did teach these doctrines with the hierarchy, with the covenant to your husband, with the covenant to Israel, with the covenant to patriarchal file leadership. All those things are in there. Wrestle with it all you want. Let's wrestle together. Israel means wrestles with God. It is good for us to wrestle with our testimonies, wrestle with hard questions. And no, there might not be an easy answer. And maybe this is going to end up with all kinds of messy, hurt things that happened in your family or mine. But I believe that the most important thing we can do is just keep wrestling with the Lord, and eventually the blessing comes. Poor old polygamist Jacob under the tree with 4 wives was wrestling with, I'm going to be in lots of trouble. I stole the birthright. I don't have it. Esau's going to come and kill me. I've done all these things. What's the answer? And he just wrestled with the Lord until he finally got the Lord to say, I will make a covenant with thee. Right? He wrestled with God and prevailed.
Okay, will you give me that last 10 seconds? Restate the last 10 seconds.
I was saying, well, gee, your earbuds died. Well, that's what happens when you have a 4-hour-long chat. Right? But the final point to pass it off to you is that Jacob wrestled. And I think that what we need to do is just keep wrestling. We need to wrestle with these things. And I'm not saying that there's any easy answers or that you're going to get some pat answer. That sort of thinking is what has led a lot of us out of the LDS church, is giving some pat answer and being told that's good enough. The rest is a mystery. It's not a mystery. Find out the mysteries, search out all things, wrestle, and keep wrestling. And when you find something that makes you think, oh, I'm done with this, don't give up. Keep wrestling with God. That's, I think, the message from Jacob. And
okay, I like it. So I'm curious, because I know that in your mind, the history is long since settled. There's no question to be had.
Yeah.
Polygamy is of God. Polygamy is of Joseph Smith. So
or at least it's of Joseph Smith. People can say that they don't believe in polygamy and they still believe in Joseph Smith, and they accept that Joseph Smith was a polygamist. I mean, my friend Lachlan Mackay is an apostle in Community of Christ, believer, faithful, wonderful man. He doesn't believe polygamy is of God. He does believe Joseph Smith's a prophet. He does accept the fact that Joseph Smith.
They don't have much use for the Book of Mormon or for Joseph Smith.
A lot of people get down on them for that, but I don't know anybody in the Community of Christ that doesn't love the Book of Mormon.
Oh, really? Okay. Interesting.
Yeah. And I know dozens and dozens of people in the Community of Christ. They read from it. They preach from it.
Some do. I would agree.
There's probably some that don't, but I think they're the exception rather than the other way around. But
interesting. It'd be fun to do that. It'd be people from the Community of Christ. Let us know, because I know there are some that do, but I know that even John Hamer acknowledged that when people want to hear from the Book of Mormon, his church is not the place to come. And so it's interesting. But
he's a Strangite, though, isn't he?
Nope. He's I think he's an apostle of the Community of Christ. He's at least a 70. He's a
John Hamer. Yeah, no, he's a 70. Yeah,
a 70. Yeah.
Well, I've heard him quote the Book of Mormon before. John Hamer.
Okay. Well, anyway, this has been really interesting. I would say I agree with you completely in wrestle with God, and I would include the scriptures in that wrestle and the Spirit of God. And I think that I hear what you're saying about coming to acceptance, but I do feel deep and abiding acceptance in what I have learned and what I'm continuing to learn. Everything I have learned since that has confirmed rather than weakened so if you would like to, I'll leave the invitation open. If you would like to come back and discuss more explicitly the scriptures and maybe the history that you find to be compelling, I'd be happy to have another discussion at some point.
Right. I mean, it might be interesting you're hitting me with some of the hard stuff from Brigham Young, some of the worst, most bizarre, most misunderstood things from Brigham Young, and it's kind of fun to hit back at the opposite end of that, which is like, how about Adam and Eve? Try to explain to me why you would think they were monogamous. When I'm like, this is so, like in the King James Version, sure. The King James Version has Jesus as unmarried. They talk about the women with Jesus, and they don't even recognize that. Like Tyndale, for goodness sakes, Tyndale, when he did the very first English translation of the four Gospels, he said Jesus's wives right in the Tyndale Bible. Do you know what I mean? All
right, we can talk about that.
The Aramaic word for the women and the wives is literally the same word. It is only a stylistic preference. The difference between the wives of Adam and Eve in the singular is literally a stylistic preference of the translators, because in Hebrew, it is literally wives, mothers of all living. It's like literally a plural word. And so people might have a preference for a monotheistic God, but in Genesis 1:1, Elohim is plural, right? Joseph Smith likes to point this one out. Sure, you can be a monotheist all you want, but don't tell me that you can prove it by Genesis 1:1. It's plural right there. So, proving it is something different. And I would say, I just think that it's easier to accept all the marriages instead of being super oh no, these ones, but not those ones.
To me, it's not about accepting or not accepting all the marriages. To me, it's about finding, seeking, discovering, and striving to obey and believe the word of God. It's about the promises in the Book of Mormon and the warnings in both the Book of Mormon and the Doctrine and Covenants that we are under condemnation for taking lightly the things that we have received, and having the Book of Mormon be the strongest book, the strongest anti-polygamy book of scripture of all of the books of scripture, followed only by the Doctrine and Covenants. And then the Bible is a distant third. And so I think for me, that's what it's about. It's helping people understand who God truly is, the nature of God. Section 132 is a completely, entirely different God than the Book of Mormon as a whole. Most easily understood in Jacob 2. But I would say with King Noah, with Riplikish, with Lehi and his people, with again and again and again, the Book of Mormon is the most anti-polygamy book of scripture there is. And
I would give you that much.
I think we should pay attention to it and believe it. I think we should hearken to it. I think that's
I would say it is the most easy to interpret as anti-polygamy, and certainly the least polygamist book of scripture is the Book of Mormon.
Okay, well, it's good to end on a point of agreement. So thank you for coming. And I know that was a cheap trick. I'm not trying to trick you. I hope you have felt like this was a positive and productive engagement.
Well, and it's good to get other people's perspectives, where they're coming from. To me, monogamy is about trying to tear apart my family. For most monogamists, polygamy is trying to complicate their family, right? It depends on what your default is, what your point of view is, where you're coming from.
And to me, it's just about coming to know God, to know who God is, know how God cares about his children, know God what our eternal destiny is, how God values his daughters, and how God sees women playing into creation. I think those are very important questions too.
They really are. And it paints a very different picture of what is the goal? What's the purpose?
Right. Are women property to be taken and given and willy-nilly, or are women beloved children of God, and God cares about their experiences, sees them and understands them, right? I think that's a critical question.
I think we agree. I think we should be able to agree on that. I'll just say thank you for having me on, and I'll be happy to share additional funny stories later, but it is true that how we view God does affect our lives now. It affects how we live, how we think about things, who we're with, and I just would say that I believe in a God of expansive love, and I think that includes plural marriage. But I'm not even in a plural marriage, really, myself. I just don't see why I should push anyone away if that were to happen. It hasn't happened. I'm not even looking for it to happen. But if it does, I wouldn't want to be the type of person who would say to anyone, you're not welcome here.
Okay. All right. I will leave it at that. And I'll say again, thank you for coming, Benjamin. And let me know if you want to have another conversation anytime. I've really appreciated this. So
You bet.
Thank you everyone for tuning in, and we'll see you next time. Thank you for sticking with us. I'm really eager to hear your thoughts on both sides of this question, to hear your answers to some of the things we discussed. It's always a little hard to be on the spot, so maybe with more thought and more time, people will have other insights to share on both sides of the issue. I want to, again, huge, sincere thank you to Benjamin Shaffer. I feel like I made a new friend. I hope that maybe he can feel that way too. I know we are diametrically opposed in our beliefs, but I really respect him coming on and the way that he engaged in this conversation. I really appreciate that. I want to again issue my invitation if there are any other people who would like to come on. I'm sure I can't have everybody necessarily, but I would love to know if there are other people who are deeply committed to plurality, to celestial plural marriage, who would like to come on. So I hope that this can keep going. So thank you so much for joining us, and I will see you next time.